Imagine a world where your toothpaste is made of crushed bones and soot, and your bathtub is a communal wooden bucket shared with 5 strangers. We've been told that people in the Middle Ages never washed, that they lived in filth and smelled like death. But is that the actual truth, or just another historical lie we've been fed? Today, we're diving into the grossest, weirdest, and most surprising hygiene habits of the medieval world. From the secret ingredients in their soap to the shocking truth about how they really treated their teeth. You're about to realize that everything you thought you knew about medieval filth is wrong. If you love long-form history that digs into the gritty details, you're in the right place. Go ahead and subscribe to join the community, and hit that like button if you've ever wondered how people survived before modern showers. Also, let me know in the comments what's the weirdest hygiene myth you've ever heard. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The origin of the dirty medieval people myth. For most modern people, the Middle Ages exist as a single unpleasant image. Dark streets, mud everywhere, people covered in filth, never bathing, never caring, and smelling so bad that simply standing near them would have been unbearable. This image is so common that it feels unquestionable. Of course, medieval people were dirty. Of course, they never bathed. Everyone knows that. Except this image did not come from the Middle Ages at all. The idea that medieval people were uniquely unhygienic is not a medieval belief. It is a modern invention. More specifically, it is a myth largely shaped between the 18th and 19th centuries, when Europeans began rewriting history in order to glorify their own progress. To understand why medieval hygiene became a punchline, we first need to understand who benefited from telling that story. By the 1700s and 1800s, Europe was obsessed with the concept of improvement, industrialization, scientific discovery, and urban expansion created a powerful narrative. The present was rational, clean, and advanced, while the past was ignorant, dirty, and backward. The Middle Ages were the perfect target. They were distant enough to be misunderstood, yet close enough to be blamed for everything modern society wanted to escape. Victorian writers, historians, and educators played a major role in shaping this stereotype. They portrayed medieval life as primitive and unsanitary to make their own era appear enlightened by comparison. Cleanliness became a moral virtue, and dirt became a symbol of intellectual failure. If medieval people were dirty, then modern people were superior. The contrast was convenient, comforting, and deeply misleading. School textbooks simplified this narrative even further. Instead of nuance, they offered caricature. Medieval towns were drawn as muddy pits. People were shown wearing the same clothes endlessly, never washing, surrounded by waste and decay. These images were repeated so often that they stopped being questioned. Over time, exaggeration hardened into fact. But historical reality is rarely that simple. One major problem with the stereotype is that it assumes medieval people shared modern beliefs about hygiene, science, and disease, and then judges them for failing to meet modern standards. This is an unfair comparison. Medieval Europeans lived in a world shaped by different medical theories, religious ideas, and practical limitations. Their understanding of cleanliness was not identical to ours, but it was not absent either. In fact, medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness, just not always in the ways we expect. Religious teachings emphasized purity of the body as well as the soul, clean clothing, clean hands, and clean living spaces were commonly associated with moral discipline. Monastic rules often required regular washing. Medical texts discussed the importance of balance, bodily maintenance, and personal care. Cleanliness was part of health, even if the science behind it was imperfect. The myth of the unwashed medieval peasant also ignores a key reality. Bathing culture never disappeared after the fall of Rome. Roman bathhouses declined, yes, but the practice of bathing itself did not vanish. Instead, it adapted. Across medieval Europe, public bathhouses existed in cities, towns, and even some rural areas. These were not rare exceptions. In many regions, they were normal parts of urban life. Ironically, many of the sources used to prove medieval filth come from moral complaints people, criticizing bathhouses for being too popular, too social, or too sinful. When medieval writers complained about bathing culture, they were not complaining about a lack of bathing. They were complaining about the opposite. Yet later historians misread these complaints. They interpreted criticism of bathhouses as evidence that people avoided bathing, when in reality it often meant people bathed frequently enough for authorities to worry about excess. Another reason the myth survived is that medieval sanitation truly was bad by modern standards. Streets were dirty. Waste disposal was inefficient. Clean water was not always available. Disease spread easily. These realities are undeniable. But sanitation and personal hygiene are not the same thing. A society can struggle with infrastructure while still practicing personal care. The Middle Ages had limited technology, not limited concern. The obsession with portraying medieval people as filthy also served another purpose, distancing modern society from uncomfortable similarities. Medieval people loved social spaces, gossip, fashion, entertainment, and pleasure. They cared about appearance. They used scents, herbs, and grooming rituals. Admitting this makes them feel uncomfortably human and far less alien than the myth allows. So instead, history flattened them into something easier to mock. The medieval people never bathed myth survived because it was repeated, not because it was accurate. It appeared in novels, paintings, political rhetoric, and eventually popular media. Films exaggerated it further, showing characters permanently covered in grime. Regardless of social class or setting, the image became entertainment. By the time modern historians began challenging this narrative, the stereotype was already deeply embedded in public imagination. But once we remove the layers of exaggeration, the truth becomes clear. Medieval hygiene was not non-existent. It was complex, inconsistent, and shaped by beliefs that made sense in their world. Sometimes it was effective. Sometimes it was disastrously wrong, but it was never simply absent. And perhaps the most ironic part of all, the period when Europeans truly began avoiding bathing on a large scale did not occur during the Middle Ages. It came later, Chapter 2. Medieval Bathhouses, Proof They Actually Bathed. If medieval people truly believed bathing was unnecessary, or worse, dangerous, then one uncomfortable question immediately arises. Why did medieval Europe build so many Public bathhouses were not rare curiosities. They were widespread, familiar, and deeply integrated into daily life across medieval cities. From England to France, from the Holy Roman Empire to Italy, bathhouses existed as ordinary urban institutions. They appeared in legal records, tax documents, medical advice manuals, and even moral complaints. A society that never bathed would not need infrastructure dedicated entirely to washing the body. Bathhouses, often called stews in England and bains in France, were usually privately owned businesses. They charged small entrance fees and offered heated water, steam rooms, and bathing tubs. Some were simple, others were surprisingly elaborate. Hot water was prepared using large furnaces, and wooden tubs were lined up in communal spaces. In colder climates, these bathhouses were especially popular during winter months. For many medieval people, bathing was not just about hygiene. It was social. Bathhouses functioned as places of relaxation, conversation, and community interaction. People went there to unwind after work, discuss news, eat meals, and even listen to music. In some regions, bathhouses offered food and drink, transforming the experience into something closer to a spa than a modern bathroom. Bathing was not a rushed, private activity. It was an event. This social nature of bathing is one reason bathhouses were so popular, and also one reason they became controversial. Contrary to popular belief, medieval authorities did not oppose bathhouses because they were unclean. They opposed them because they were too appealing. Bathhouses encouraged mixed gender interaction, leisure, and indulgence. Moral critics worried that bathing together weakened discipline and tempted people into sinful behavior. Some bathhouses eventually became associated with prostitution, further damaging their reputation. But notice what this criticism actually reveals. No one was complaining that medieval people refused to bathe. They were complaining that people bathed too much, stayed too long, and enjoyed it too freely. Medical texts from the Middle Ages also support the idea that bathing was normal. Physicians trained in the tradition believed that bathing helped balance the body's humors. Warm baths were recommended for relaxation, pain relief, and certain illnesses. Cold baths were sometimes advised for strengthening the body. While the medical reasoning was flawed by modern standards, the practice itself was encouraged. In fact, medieval doctors frequently warned against excessive bathing, not because it was dirty, but because it could overstimulate the body. Their concern was moderation, not avoidance. The existence of rules around bathing further proves how common it was. Many cities regulated bathhouse hours, pricing, and behavior. Some required bathhouses to close on religious holidays. Others enforced gender separation on specific days. You do not regulate something that barely exists. Regulation is evidence of demand.com. Even monasteries, often imagined as places of extreme austerity, practiced regular washing. Monastic rules varied. But cleanliness was commonly associated with spiritual discipline. Monks washed hands before prayers, cleaned their bodies during certain seasons, and maintained orderly living spaces. Dirt was not considered holy. Self-control was, of course, access to bathhouses was not equal. Urban residents benefited far more than rural peasants. Cities had infrastructure, water access, and customer density to support bathing businesses. Rural populations relied more on rivers, streams, and household washing. This difference later contributed to the myth that peasants never bathed, when in reality their bathing methods were simply less visible in written records. Another overlooked detail is frequency. Medieval people did not bathe daily the way modern society often expects. But daily bathing is a relatively recent habit shaped by modern plumbing, soap availability, and cultural norms. In the medieval world, bathing weekly or seasonally was common and considered sufficient. Cleanliness was judged differently, not ignored. So why does the myth persist? Because bathhouses eventually declined. By the late Middle Ages, many public bathhouses closed not because people stopped caring about cleanliness, but because of fear. As plague outbreaks devastated Europe, public gathering places became dangerous. Overcrowded spaces filled with warm water and shared air were suddenly associated with disease. Bathhouses were not abandoned out of laziness or ignorance, but out of survival instincts. Ironically, this decline happened just as later generations began looking backward and blaming medieval people for never bathing. The timeline does not match the stereotype. Bathing culture did not disappear during the Middle Ages. It weakened later, under pressure from disease, fear, and changing medical theories. Yet popular history compressed centuries into a single false image, erasing the reality of medieval bathhouses entirely. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all, some medieval people were probably cleaner than many early modern Europeans who came after them. Bathhouses prove one thing beyond doubt. Medieval people did bathe frequently, socially, enthusiastically, sometimes irresponsibly, but never, never. The myth survives not because medieval people avoided water, but because later generations forgot how much they loved it. Chapter 3: Soap, Scent, and Clean Clothes. What clean meant in the Middle Ages. When modern people imagine medieval hygiene, they usually picture a complete absence of soap. The assumption is simple: no soap, no clean. But this assumption collapses almost immediately when confronted with historical evidence. Medieval Europeans did have soap. They used it regularly, and in some regions they were remarkably skilled at making it. Soap production in medieval Europe did not begin as a luxury. It emerged as a practical craft. Early soaps were made from animal fats or olive oil combined with alkaline substances derived from wood ash. These soaps were not identical to modern commercial bars, but they were effective enough to remove dirt and oils from skin and fabric. Soap making became a specialized trade, particularly in southern Europe. By the late Middle Ages, soap production centers existed in places like Marseille, Castile, and parts of Italy. Olive oil-based soaps were considered superior and were widely traded. These soaps were used not only for bathing but also for Laundering clothes an activity that medieval people took very seriously. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval hygiene, the importance of clean clothing. Medieval people may not have bathed daily, but they changed and washed their clothes. Far more often than popular myths suggest, linen undergarments were worn directly against the skin and were designed to absorb sweat and dirt. These garments were washed frequently, sometimes weekly or even more often. Clean clothes were seen as a primary defense against bodily filth. In medieval thinking, cleanliness did not always begin with the skin. It began with what touched the skin. Medical and moral texts repeatedly emphasize the importance of fresh linens. Physicians believed that dirty clothing trapped harmful substances against the body. Clean clothes, on the other hand, allowed the body to breathe, while this belief was rooted in flawed theories of humors and vapors. The practical result was a strong cultural emphasis on laundering. Even poor households prioritized clean linen when possible. Washing clothes was labor requiring water access, time, and physical effort. The fact that medieval families invested energy into laundering demonstrates that cleanliness mattered despite technological limitations. Scent also played a significant role in medieval hygiene. Contrary to the idea that medieval people accepted foul odors as normal, they actively tried to avoid them. Smell was not merely unpleasant, it was believed to be dangerous. Medieval medical theory held that bad air, or miasma, caused disease. As a result, pleasant scents were associated with health and protection. People used herbs, flowers, and perfumes to improve their personal smell and their environment. Lavender, rosemary, sage, rose, and mint were commonly used. These were carried in small pouches, placed in clothing, or used to scent rooms and bathwater. Wealthier individuals owned perfumes made from distilled plant oils, while poorer people relied on locally available herbs. Perfume was not vanity alone, it was preventative medicine. This belief explains why medieval people sometimes appear over-scented in historical accounts. They were not masking filth out of indifference. They were attempting to protect themselves from invisible threats they believed traveled through the air. Hair and grooming also mattered. Men and women combed their hair regularly, not only for appearance, but to remove dirt and parasites. Lice were common, but they were not ignored. Delosing combs were widespread and designed specifically to address the problem. The existence of these tools alone contradicts the idea that medieval people simply accepted being dirty. Beards were trimmed, nails were cleaned, faces and hands were washed daily, even when full-body bathing was less frequent. These routines were practical, habitual, and socially expected. A visibly unkempt appearance could signal poverty, illness, or moral failure. Yet, despite all this effort, medieval hygiene still feels insufficient to modern observers. Why? Because modern hygiene is shaped by abundance. We have unlimited water, mass-produced soap, indoor plumbing, and chemical disinfectants. Medieval people had none of these advantages. Cleanliness required work, planning, and compromise. What looks like neglect from a modern perspective was often the result of limited resources, not indifference. Another factor that fuels misunderstanding is survival bias in historical sources. Chronicles, sermons, and complaints tend to focus on problems. They described filth when it exists, not routine cleanliness when everything functions normally. Historians later read these complaints and mistake them for descriptions of everyday life. No one wrote excitedly about washing their clothes because it was expected. What survives in the record are warnings, criticisms, and extremes. So while medieval hygiene was imperfect, it was intentional. People washed. They scented, they groomed. They cleaned their clothes. Their definition of clean was shaped by their environment, beliefs, and technology, not by ignorance or laziness. The real question is not whether medieval people cared about hygiene. It is whether modern people have misunderstood what hygiene looked like before modern plumbing made it effortless. And as we move forward, the irony deepens because the era most responsible for abandoning bathing did not come before the Middle Ages. It came after Chapter 4, when bathing became dangerous, disease, fear, and the collapse of bathing culture. If medieval people bathed, used soap, washed their clothes, and cared about cleanliness, then one question becomes unavoidable. Why does history remember Europeans as unwashed for so long afterward? The answer lies not in medieval ignorance, but in fear, specifically fear born from disease. The turning point was the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, it killed tens of millions of people. Entire cities were emptied. Families vanished. No one understood what caused it. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, no concept of bacteria. People searched desperately for explanations. And when answers did not come, fear filled the gap. Medical theory at the time relied heavily on the concept of humors and invisible vapors. Illness was believed to spread through corrupted air. Smell became suspicious. Warmth became dangerous. Anything that opened the body to the outside world was suddenly seen as a risk. Bathing, once associated with health and relaxation, became a threat. Hot water was believed to open the pores of the skin. Open pores, doctors warned, allowed poisonous air to enter the body. Steam-filled bathhouses, once celebrated, were now viewed as death traps. Public bathing, especially communal bathing, began to decline rapidly. This shift did not happen overnight, but it was profound. Cities that once regulated baths for moral reasons now closed them for medical ones. What had once been a space of health became a space of suspicion. Even physicians who previously recommended bathing began advising caution or complete avoidance, particularly during times of epidemic. Ironically, this fear-based rejection of bathing happened after the Middle Ages had already begun to transition into the early modern period. Yet history collapsed these times. Later generations blamed medieval people for a hygienic collapse that occurred centuries after the medieval world had already passed. As bathing declined, new hygiene practices emerged, none of them particularly effective. Instead of washing the body, people focused on changing clothes, airing rooms, and using heavy perfumes. The goal was no longer to remove dirt, but to block invisible threats from entering the body. Perfume use increased dramatically. People carried scented objects, wore fragrance-soaked garments, and burned incense indoors. Cleanliness became less about water and more about smell. If something smelled pleasant, it felt safe. If it smelled foul, it was feared. This period marks a critical misunderstanding in popular history. The era most associated with avoiding bathing is often mislabeled as medieval, when in reality it belongs largely to the Renaissance and early modern Europe. The people who built grand palaces celebrated human reason, and advanced art and science were often bathing less frequently than their medieval predecessors. Fear replaced habit. Public bathhouses, once centers of social life, disappeared or were repurposed. Rivers and streams were avoided during outbreaks. Medical advice discouraged unnecessary exposure to water. Cleanliness did not vanish, but it transformed into something more symbolic than practical, and this transformation had consequences. Without regular bathing, parasites flourished. Skin conditions worsened. Odor increased, reinforcing the belief that strong scents were necessary. The cycle fed itself. The less people bathed, the more perfume they used. The more perfume they used, the less obvious the need for bathing seemed. History would later remember this entire era as a single, undifferentiated past, and medieval people would take the blame. But the truth is deeply uncomfortable for modern narratives of progress. At the very moment, Europeans believed themselves to be advancing beyond the Middle Ages. Their personal hygiene was, in some ways, moving backward, and that contradiction is essential to understanding why the myth of medieval filth survives. Because myths are easier than Chapter 5. What was actually disgusting about medieval hygiene and what wasn't? By now, one thing should be clear. The idea that medieval people were filthy because they never bathed is largely false. But dismissing that myth does not mean medieval life was clean. Some aspects of medieval hygiene were genuinely unpleasant by any standard, modern or historical. The mistake is not in recognizing the filth, but in misunderstanding where it came from. The most serious problem was sanitation. Medieval cities struggled with waste management on a scale that is difficult to imagine today. Human waste, animal droppings, food scraps, and industrial byproducts all accumulated rapidly in crowded urban environments. While some cities had regulations governing waste disposal, enforcement was inconsistent and infrastructure was limited. Many homes relied on chamber pots. These were emptied into cesspits, gutters, or directly into the street. In some places, waste was dumped into rivers that also served as sources of drinking water. This was not because medieval people believed waste was harmless, but because they lacked efficient alternatives. The result was contamination. Even when individuals practiced personal hygiene, washing hands, cleaning clothes, bathing occasionally, they were surrounded by environmental filth beyond their control. Clean bodies existed in dirty cities. This distinction matters because it explains why disease spread so easily despite people caring about cleanliness. Another uncomfortable reality was parasites. Lice, fleas, and other insects were a constant presence in medieval life. They thrived in clothing seams, bedding, and shared living spaces. Parasites were not signs of moral failure or laziness. They were an inevitable consequence of limited pest control, technology, and close-quarter living. Importantly, medieval people did not ignore parasites. They actively fought them. Delousing combs were common household items. People inspected each other's hair and clothing, especially within families. Certain herbs were believed to repel insects, and garments were aired or beaten to reduce infestation. These practices were time-consuming and imperfect, but they reflect effort, not apathy. What truly shocks modern audiences, however, is medieval medicine. Medical treatments often involve substances that feel disturbing. Today, animal blood, bile, feces, and urine were used in remedies. Some treatments involved applying rotting materials to wounds. These practices were rooted in ancient medical traditions that prioritized balance and symbolism over empirical testing. From a modern perspective, these remedies seem horrifying, but within medieval understanding, they were logical. Illness was not caused by bacteria, but by imbalance. Treatments aimed to restore harmony, not eliminate microbes. Ironically, some of these remedies were applied to bodies that had been recently washed. Another commonly misunderstood feature of medieval life was the use of shared spaces. Bathhouses, beds, benches, and clothing could all be communal. Privacy was limited. This increased the spread of parasites and infections. Even when personal hygiene existed, again, the issue was not ignorance, it was density. Medieval cities were crowded, poorly ventilated, and heavily trafficked by animals and humans alike. Clean habits struggled to overcome dirty environments. And yet, many things we assume were disgusting simply were not. Medieval people did wash their hands, particularly before meals. They cleaned their faces daily. They valued fresh linens. They cared about appearance, scent, and grooming. A visibly filthy person could be socially judged, not accepted as normal. What feels most uncomfortable to modern observers is not medieval hygiene itself, but its limitations. Cleanliness required effort without guaranteed results. You could wash and still be surrounded by waste. You could bathe and still catch disease. This reality exposes a deeper misunderstanding in how we judge the past. We often imagine medieval people as accepting filth because we project modern expectations onto a world without modern infrastructure. But when we strip away that projection, a more honest picture emerges. Medieval people tried to be clean in a world that made cleanliness difficult. The disgust we feel today comes not from their indifference, but from their constraints. And perhaps the most disturbing realization of all, many modern cities, without constant sanitation systems, would collapse into similar conditions within days. The Middle Ages were not uniquely dirty. They were simply human without the systems we now take for granted. Chapter 6: Religion, Morality, and the Myth that Cleanliness was Sinful. One of the most persistent misconceptions about medieval hygiene is the belief that religion discouraged cleanliness. According to this myth, medieval Christians saw bathing as sinful, vanity-driven, or morally dangerous. Dirt, in this narrative, becomes a symbol of holiness, proof of spiritual devotion through physical neglect. This idea is compelling. It feels dramatic, and it is largely wrong. Medieval Christianity did not teach that filth was virtuous. What it taught was moderation. Religious texts and sermons from the Middle Ages consistently emphasize order, discipline, and self-control. Cleanliness was associated with respect both for God and for the community. Washing hands before prayer or meals was common. Clean clothing was encouraged. A tidy appearance reflected inner discipline, not moral weakness. What religion warned against was excess. Bathing itself was not sinful. Indulgence was. Public bathhouses, as we have seen, were sometimes criticized not because they involved water, but because they encouraged leisure, luxury, and temptation. Mixed gender bathing, extended socializing, and associated sexual activity were the real targets of moral concern. In other words, the problem was not cleanliness. The problem was pleasure. This distinction matters because later interpretations blurred it. When early modern writers looked back at medieval religious criticism of bath, they misunderstood it. They assumed opposition to bathing meant opposition to hygiene. In reality, it meant opposition to uncontrolled behavior. Monastic life provides a clear example of this misunderstanding. Monks are often imagined as rejecting physical comfort entirely, but most monastic rules included provisions for washing. Monasteries had designated washing areas. Hands and faces were cleaned daily. Full-body bathing occurred at regulated times, often linked to seasons or health needs. Monks did not avoid cleanliness to appear holy. They avoided excess to maintain discipline. Even saints associated with extreme asceticism were exceptions, not models for everyday life. Their practices were admired precisely because they were unusual and difficult, not because they were expected of everyone. For ordinary medieval people, cleanliness was practical, not spiritual theater.com. Religious authorities also understood that filth caused discomfort and social disorder. Cities enforced cleanliness partly because disorder reflected poorly on the moral state of the community. A clean environment was associated with godliness, stability, and divine favor. This belief extended into hospitals and charitable institutions, many of which were run by religious organizations. Clean bedding, washed patients, and orderly spaces were considered acts of compassion. While medical outcomes were limited, the intent was not negligent. The idea that medieval religion promoted dirt likely survives because it fits a modern stereotype of anti-science faith. But this stereotype ignores how medieval people actually lived. Religion shaped hygiene by imposing structure, not by rejecting cleanliness. Ironically, some of the strongest religious criticism of bathing appears later during periods of epidemic when fear redefined moral priorities. Even then, the concern was not that water was sinful, but that it was dangerous. The moral language changed, but the target remained excess and risk, not hygiene itself. So when modern audiences imagine medieval people choosing filth for spiritual reasons, they are projecting a story that medieval sources simply do not support. Cleanliness was never considered evil. Loss of control was, and this distinction helps explain why medieval hygiene, though imperfect, persisted for so long until fear, not faith, finally undermined it. Chapter 7. Why the Myth Survived. Superiority, Storytelling, and Selective History. If medieval people bathed, used soap, cleaned their clothes, and cared about hygiene, then the persistence of the filthy Middle Ages myth demands an explanation. Myths do not survive for centuries by accident. They survive because they are useful. The myth of medieval filth serves a powerful psychological purpose. It makes the present feel superior to the past. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe experienced rapid technological and social change. Industrialization transformed cities. Scientific discoveries challenged religious explanations of the world. Cleanliness became a visible symbol of progress. Running water, sewage systems, and mass-produced soap allowed people to do something their ancestors could not: be clean with minimal effort. Instead of recognizing this as a technological advantage, many writers reframed it as moral evolution. The Middle Ages were recast as a dark age of ignorance and filth. The modern world, by contrast, was portrayed as rational, enlightened, and hygienic. This narrative did not require accuracy, it required contrast. Victorian historians played a central role in shaping this image. Their writing often blended moral judgment with historical description. Dirt was not merely unpleasant, it was proof of backwardness. Cleanliness became evidence of civilization itself. This framing seeped into education. School textbooks simplified complex centuries into a single stereotype. Medieval people were shown living in mud, surrounded by waste, indifferent to their own condition. Nuance disappeared. Regional differences vanished. Centuries of change were flattened into one grim picture. Popular culture amplified the effect. Novels, plays, and later films relied on visual shorthand. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, and dark streets immediately signaled the past to audiences. These images were not designed to educate, they were designed to communicate quickly. Accuracy slowed the story down, so exaggeration won. Movies and television made the myth unforgettable. Medieval characters were permanently filthy, regardless of status or context. Kings looked as dirty as peasants. Cities looked equally miserable across centuries. The audience learned to associate medieval life with constant grime. Once visual language takes hold, it is almost impossible to undo. Even modern documentaries sometimes repeat the stereotype because it feels familiar. Correcting it requires explanation. Explanation takes time, and time competes with entertainment. There is also an uncomfortable emotional component to the myth. Believing that medieval people were disgusting allows modern audiences to distance themselves from the past. It creates a clean break between us and them. If they were filthy and ignorant, then we are clean and enlightened. The comparison flatters the present, but this comfort comes at a cost. It prevents us from seeing medieval people as intelligent, adaptive humans responding to their environment. It hides the fact that many of their struggles were infrastructural, not moral. It also obscures the reality that progress is not linear. History does not move smoothly from dirty to clean, from ignorant to smart. It advances, retreats, and adapts. The hygiene myth survives because it supports a simple story. Modernity saved us from ourselves. The truth is more complicated. Modern sanitation did not emerge because people suddenly cared more. It emerged because technology made caring effective. Medieval people wanted to be clean. They simply lacked the systems to guarantee it. And perhaps that realization is the most uncomfortable of all, because it suggests that our cleanliness is not a moral achievement, but a temporary condition, dependent on fragile systems. The Middle Ages were not uniquely disgusting. They were misunderstood. Chapter 8. The truth about medieval hygiene, messy, human, and uncomfortably familiar. So did medieval people bathe. Yes, they did. Not perfectly, not daily, not with modern soap, plumbing, or germ theory, but they washed, they groomed, they cleaned their clothes, and they cared deeply about how their bodies interacted with the world around them. The image of a medieval population, indifferent to filth, collapses. Under even light historical scrutiny, what remains after the myth is removed is something far more interesting and far less comforting. Medieval hygiene was inconsistent. Some people had access to bathhouses and clean water. Others did not. Urban residents experienced different hygiene realities than rural populations. Wealth shaped access. Geography mattered. Climate mattered. Hygiene was not universal, but neither was neglect. And crucially, medieval people understood that cleanliness mattered even if they misunderstood why. They believed dirt could harm the body. They believed smell could carry disease. They believed clean clothing protected health. Their logic was flawed by modern standards, but their intentions were not. They acted with the best explanations available to them. This matters because it forces us to confront a dangerous assumption, that ignorance equals apathy. Medieval people were not passive victims of filth. They were active participants in maintaining their health within severe limitations. They washed what they could, when they could, with what they had. When hygiene failed, it was often because infrastructure failed. Cities lacked sewage systems. Clean water was difficult to distribute. Waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. No amount of personal effort could fully overcome these barriers. Sound familiar? Modern hygiene feels permanent because it is invisible. Pipes hide waste. Clean water flows effortlessly. Soap appears cheaply and endlessly. But remove those systems, and the medieval world becomes uncomfortably close. The myth of medieval filth survives because it allows us to believe we are fundamentally different. We are not. The people of the Middle Ages laughed, worried, cleaned, complained, and adapted just as we do. They feared disease. They tried remedies. They followed advice from authorities. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they were disastrously wrong, but they were never indifferent. And perhaps the most ironic truth of all is this. The era that truly normalized avoiding bathing came after the Middle Ages, driven not by ignorance, but by fear and misplaced medical confidence. History does not reward certainty. It punishes misunderstanding. The story of medieval hygiene is not a story of stupidity or filth. It is a story of humans doing their best in a world without modern systems, often succeeding, sometimes failing, and always being judged by people who came later. So the next time someone says, medieval people never bathed, remember this. They did, They just didn't live in a world that made cleanliness easy. And neither would we. Chapter 9. How clean were they compared to everyone else? One of the most misleading aspects of the medieval hygiene myth is that it isolates Europe from the rest of the world. When people say medieval people were dirty, they usually mean medieval. Europeans, and even then, only a specific, exaggerated version of them. This narrow focus creates the illusion that medieval Europe was uniquely unhygienic. It was not. Compared to many ancient societies, medieval Europeans were not experiencing a collapse of hygiene, but a transformation. Roman public sanitation systems had declined, yes, but personal hygiene practices adapted rather than disappeared. Meanwhile, other parts of the world developed their own traditions of cleanliness under very different conditions. In the Islamic world, for example, hygiene was deeply embedded in daily life. Regular washing was tied to religious practice. Public bathhouses flourished. Soap-making advanced rapidly. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba maintained bathing cultures that surpassed much of Europe in scale and consistency. This contrast is often used to shame medieval Europe, but it misses the point. Hygiene is not a universal ladder where societies climb at the same pace. It is shaped by climate, water access, religion, urban planning, and political stability. Europe's fragmented cities, colder climates, and recurring epidemics produced different outcomes, necessarily worse intentions. Even within Europe, comparisons are revealing. Early medieval Scandinavians bathed more frequently than their southern neighbors. Archaeological evidence suggests regular grooming, hair care, and washing. In fact, complaints from English writers about overly clean Vikings suggest that hygiene could even be socially competitive. Cleanliness was not absent. It was uneven. What truly distinguishes medieval hygiene from modern hygiene is not effort but feedback. Medieval people could not see bacteria. They could not measure effectiveness. A practice that felt clean might still spread disease. A behavior that looked filthy might be harmless. Without scientific tools, trial and error dominated. Modern people benefit from centuries of accumulated error. When we judge medieval hygiene without acknowledging this, we mistake outcome for intent, and perhaps the most revealing comparison of all is this. For much of history, everyone smelled by modern standards. Cleanliness is relative. The past feels dirtier not because people were because our expectations have shifted. Medieval Europeans were not uniquely disgusting. They were simply not modern. Chapter 10. The real myth that we're smarter than the past. The most dangerous myth about medieval hygiene is not that medieval people were dirty. It is the belief that we are immune to being wrong in the same way. Medieval people trusted authority. They followed medical advice. They adjusted their habits in response to fear and crisis. When doctors warned that bathing could kill, people listened. When perfume was believed to protect health, it spread rapidly. From the future, these decisions look foolish. From the present, they looked responsible. This is the uncomfortable lesson hiding beneath the hygiene myth. Medieval people were not uniquely ignorant. They were operating with incomplete information, just like every generation before and after them. History repeatedly shows that confidence often outpaces understanding. There will come a time when future generations look back at modern habits, our chemicals, our medicines, our assumptions, and wonder how we ever believed they were safe. They will mock our certainty just as we mock medieval fear of water. The myth of medieval filth survives because it reassures us. It tells us that we are cleaner not because of fragile systems, but because we are wiser. It transforms plumbing into progress and soap into superiority. It replaces humility with comfort. But the truth is less flattering. Medieval hygiene was flawed, inconsistent, and constrained, but it was thoughtful. It was intentional, and it was human. The people of the Middle Ages did not live in filth because they didn't care. They lived in a world that made cleanliness difficult, and they adapted as best they could. When we reduce them to a joke, we are not revealing their ignorance. We are revealing our own, because the real myth is not that medieval people never bathed. The real myth is that history moves neatly from stupid to smart. It doesn't. It moves from human to human,